Hello, and welcome to the Certified Rehabilitation Counselor Examination Preparation Podcast. We are in Module 1, and the topics in this module cover related to professional orientation and ethical practice knowledge domain, which encompasses 10.7% of the questions on the CRC exam. The information in this module is organized into 3 lessons or chapters for the podcast. The first one is Ethical Standards and Client Rights. The second is Historical Foundations, Laws, and Policies. And the third is Professional Roles, Functions, Credentialing, and Organizations of Practice. The learning objectives for this module are: the CRC exam covers 2 major sections. Rehabilitation and disability is section 1, and counseling is section 2. And so the learning objectives are organized based on this structure. So for rehabilitation and disability, by the completion of this module, you will be able to define laws and public policy and identify how they affect individuals with disabilities. You will be able to define and use rehabilitation terminology and ideas. You will be able to recognize and identify different organizational structures of rehabilitation counseling practice settings. And you will be able to recognize, incorporate, and explain historical and philosophical foundations of rehabilitation counseling. Now for the counseling section, by the completion of this module, you will be able to describe ethical standards for rehabilitation counselors and devise solutions for how to manage risks. You will be able to identify and implement services that take into account diverse counseling issues. You will be able to differentiate roles, functions, and relationships with providers and professionals. And you will be able to describe rehabilitation counseling issues and devise solutions. The learning objectives and topics covered in this module were generated based on information provided on the CRCC website. Welcome to topic 1.1, Ethical Standards and Client Rights. The topics covered in this episode include CRC ethical standards, the core values of rehabilitation counseling, principles of ethical behavior, client right of disclosure, ethics of client-counselor non-professional relationships, client and counselor rights, limitations to client confidentiality, counselor rights, and ethical decision-making. We'll start with CRCC ethical standards. The Commission on Rehabilitation Counseling Certification, or CRCC, expects certified rehabilitation counselors, or CRCs, to possess and practice the 6 core values of rehabilitation counseling. Additionally, certified rehabilitation counselors are expected to maintain practices within the CRCC Code of Ethical Standards. This code includes principles of ethical behavior, client right of disclosure, and the ethics of client-counselor non-professional relationships. We'll start with the core values of rehabilitation counseling. First, services must be based on rehabilitation models that promote cooperation between client and counselor. Second, rehabilitation counselors must recognize the inherent worth and dignity of each person. Third, rehabilitation counselors must concentrate on the client's strengths rather than their weakness. Fourth, rehabilitation counselors must ensure that each disabled person has the opportunity to obtain a reasonable position and interact with the rest of society. Fifth, rehabilitation counselors advocate for disabled people and work to ensure that each disabled person is afforded equal opportunities and rights. And sixth, rehabilitation counselors must recognize that inability to function is not necessarily the result of a single obstacle, but is often the result of a combination of obstacles. Moving on to principles of ethical behavior. The principles of ethical behavior consist of 5 behavioral standards that CRCs are expected to embody. First, autonomy. Respect the right of the client to make personal choices. Second, beneficence. Always intend to do well and act in the best interests of others. Third, non-maleficence, do no harm, similar to the Hippocratic Oath. Fourth, justice, be fair and impartial to all clients, do not neglect one client in favor of another, and do not let personal bias influence interactions with clients. And finally, fifth, fidelity, avoid insincere statements and impossible promises. Next, client right of disclosure. The client right of disclosure states that the client should be informed of the credentials possessed by the counselor, the intent and purpose of the rehabilitation plan, the technique, risks, and benefits of the services to be provided, how diagnostic tests and evaluations will be performed and used, the cost of services and payment expectations, the right to refuse services, the right to know who may view their records, and how their information will be used. Next, the ethics of client-counselor non-professional relationships. Relationships with clients, family members of clients, external agency or service provider professionals, and internal agency staff members should be avoided. Additionally, CRCs should not provide professional counseling services to family members, reach out to existing or potential clients on social media platforms, or accept communication or friend requests from clients. Moving on to client and counselor rights. All clients participating in the rehabilitation process have autonomous rights that must be respected by the CRC. The most important client right to respect is the right to informed consent. Informed consent means clients have the right to choose to enter the rehabilitation counseling relationship, undergo the rehabilitation counseling process, or exit the rehabilitation counseling process without receiving services or obtaining employment. Clients also have a legal right to privacy, which precludes counselors from sharing information related to the client's case with entities other than professionals providing services. When working with clients who are under the protection of guardianship, it is important to understand guardianship. Guardianship in the rehabilitation services process occurs when the client is legally unable to enter a contractual agreement to work with rehabilitation professionals. If a client is under guardianship, CRCs will discuss client rights, treatment plans, and provide informed consent to the overseeing guardian in addition to the client receiving services. Even if the client is unable to provide legal consent, the client should provide assent, verbal or nonverbal acknowledgement of agreement to services and rehabilitation plans. There are limitations to client confidentiality. In addition to respecting client rights, CRCs must inform clients of their limits of confidentiality at the onset of the counseling relationship. Limits of confidentiality include counselors will share confidential information with or without client consent if sound legal or ethical justification is given. Counselors have the duty to inform others if the client is facilitating or aiding in abuse, neglect, or harm to self or others. Counselors are justified in disclosing client medical information to at-risk identifiable third parties if the client possesses a disease that is known to be highly communicable and life-threatening. And counselors are required to disclose certain client information if the counselor is subpoenaed by a court of law. In addition to respecting client rights, CRCs have the right to exercise their own professional rights. Counselors have the right to refuse a client's case if outside influences or personal issues will prevent the counselor from providing quality, unbiased services to the client. In order to ethically exercise the right to refuse clients based on personal conflicts of interest, counselors must justify their decision based on the CRCC Code of Ethics, i.e., counselors can refuse to provide services to a family member or friend, but counselors cannot refuse to provide services based on a client's sexual orientation, religion, gender identity, etc. Furthermore, counselors have the right to refuse client cases if they have determined the client will not significantly benefit from receiving services. Finally, a counselor has the right to refuse to provide services if they believe the service will cause harm to the client. In addition to exercising professional rights, CRCs should exercise risk management when entering and maintaining a counseling relationship. Counselors should take precautionary steps to protect themselves from being accused of inappropriate behavior from the client or the client's guardian. For example, conduct meetings in a location with privacy but not complete obscurity. Additionally, individuals with disabilities are at a higher risk for exploitation or abuse by individuals without disabilities. Counselors need to be mindful of the increased risk of their consumers being taken advantage of by potential employers or those seeking to benefit through exploiting an individual with disabilities, e.g., employers who attempt to pay the individual significantly less than coworkers in the same position, individuals seeking monetary gain through imposing multi-level marketing strategies on individuals who may not understand their financial responsibility upon signing up. Next, we will discuss ethical decision-making. In cases where ethical practices are in question, CRCs should assess their options by posing two questions. 1, would the counselor want this for themselves or a family member? And 2, does this action produce the least amount of harm for the client? Additionally, the American Counseling Association has published a 7-step ethical decision-making model that is one option to use when encountering a potential ethical dilemma in counseling services. Other models for use can be found on the CRCC Contemporary Decision-Making Models webpage. The steps of the ACA Ethical Decision-Making Model are as follows. 1. Identify the problem. Gather as much information as you can about the situation. Focus on the facts and determine if it is an ethical, legal, professional, or clinical problem, or a combination of more than one. 2. Apply the American Counseling Association Code of Ethics. Refer to the ACA Code of Ethics and/or the CRCC Code of Ethics to review ethical codes and determine if the issue has been addressed before in a previous case. If the dilemma has not been addressed in a previous case and/or the Code of Ethics does not offer guidelines on your exact dilemma, proceed through steps 3 through 7. 3. Determine the nature and dimensions of the dilemma. The following steps should be utilized to properly determine the nature and dimensions of the dilemma. 1. Examine potential implications of the dilemma from the viewpoint of each of the principles of ethical behavior. 2. Examine relevant professional literature to ensure that you are up to date on factors that may impact the decision. 3. Consult with other counseling professionals to gain insight, information, and context you may have missed. And 4. Seek input from professional organizations to gain further insight. 4. Generate potential courses of action. The following steps should be utilized to generate multiple courses of action. Step 1. Brainstorm as many potential courses as possible. Think outside the box and don't rule anything out yet. Step 2. Generate as many potential solutions or outcomes as possible. Again, don't rule anything out yet. Step 3. Consult with at least one colleague who follows the CRCC Code of Ethics and ask for help generating potential courses and solutions. 5. Consider the potential consequences of all options and determine a course of action. The following steps should be utilized to help determine a course of action. Step 1. Refer to your potential courses of action generated in the previous step and evaluate the implications for the client, counselor, and any other individuals who may be affected by the decision. Step 2. Eliminate problematic courses of action that produce negative or harmful outcomes. And Step 3. Review the remaining options and determine which choice best resolves the situation. 6. Evaluate the selected course of action. The following tests should be applied to help evaluate the selected courses of action. 1. Justice. Consider if the course of action is just and fair to all involved parties. 2. Publicity. Consider how you would feel and react if your decision was to be shared with the general public. And 3. Universality. Consider if you would recommend this course of action to a colleague in a similar situation. And finally, 7. Implement the course of action. Take necessary actions to implement your selected course of action and follow up on the outcomes and consequences, either positive or negative, of your choice. Module 1.2, Historical Foundations, Laws, and Policies. Topics covered in this module include historical foundations of rehabilitation counseling, philosophical foundations of rehabilitation counseling, and laws and public policy affecting people with disabilities. The historical foundations of rehabilitation counseling. Before state and federal rehabilitation agencies were established, rehabilitation services were provided by private, religious, philanthropic, and charitable organizations. However, four major events occurring throughout the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century created a political and social environment that supported the creation and implementation of public vocational rehabilitation services. These events are 1. The Industrial Revolution. Occurring in America from 1820 to 1870, the Industrial Revolution resulted in a national shift from a farm-based economy to an industry-based economy. This shift resulted in mass relocation of individuals from rural areas to urban cities. The resulting increased workforce in factories and workshops produced an increase in workplace injuries and acquired disabilities. As such, there became an increased number of individuals with disabilities looking for routes to re-enter the workforce after acquiring their injury or disability. 2. Economic, social, and political reform through the progressive movement. Throughout the 1890s to the 1920s, rapid reforms in government functioning, social standards and expectations, and political ideas allowed the federal government to create more opportunities for individuals to compete for employment opportunities. 3. Compulsory public education. By 1918, all states required children to attend school. Requiring children to attend school and receive training, ultimately designed, at that time, to instill vocational skills and train productive workers, illuminated the number of children who were unable to participate in educational and vocational training activities. And 4. Institution of federal income tax. Ratified in 1913, monies collected from federal income taxes could be used by the federal government to sponsor and fund VR programs for soldiers, veterans, and civilians. Additionally, tax write-offs for rehabilitation services bolstered the value of rehabilitation services in that the funds used to enable an individual with disability to return to the workforce were ultimately returned back to the federal government when that individual paid income taxes to the government. These four events serve to create an ideal environment in which society recognized the value of providing rehabilitation services to individuals with disabilities so that they may rejoin and contribute to society in a meaningful way. Sanctioned state and federal vocational rehabilitation services emerged through several federal legislations as described in the tabs below. The Smith-Hughes Act of 1917 created the Federal Board of Vocational Education, required states participating in vocational education programs to create a state board of vocational education to aid in collaborations with the federal board, and made federal funds available to each state on a matching basis for vocational education programs. The Soldiers Rehabilitation Act of 1918 was the first federal program in the United States for vocational rehabilitation of veterans with disabilities. This authorized and provided vocational training and placement of World War I veterans with disabilities as a result of military services, and was administered under the Federal Board of Vocational Education. The Smith-Vest Act of 1920 is the first civilian vocational rehabilitation act. It provided federal money at a 50-50 match to state contributions to their vocational rehabilitation system, and is the cornerstone of present-day vocational rehabilitation. The Barton-La Follette Act of 1943. This act extended services to individuals with intellectual disabilities, mental illness, and physical disabilities. It provided the first state federal rehabilitation support for individuals who were blind, and doubled the federal or state budget for VR programs. The Rehabilitation Act Amendments of 1954 increased the funding base for rehabilitation services to 66%. It was previously 50% via the Smith-Vest Act. It expanded services to a larger number of individuals with intellectual disabilities or mental illness, and authorized grants to colleges and universities for the training of professional rehabilitation workers. The Social Security Amendments of 1956 authorized distribution of Social Security disability stipends to individuals with permanently disabling conditions or individuals considered incapable of returning to competitive integrated employment. Moving on to the philosophical foundations of rehabilitation counseling. There are 3 philosophical principles that define a client's role in the rehabilitation process. 1, the client must remain involved in the rehabilitation process, beginning with the initial referral and ending with case closure. The client has a responsibility to maintain engagement throughout the process and provide input to ensure that the rehabilitation plan is making meaningful progress. 2, the client must recognize their personal beliefs and feelings may affect their functioning. The client must be willing to work with their counselor to reshape their attitude, belief, and perception of their disability if necessary. And 3, the client must be willing to accept help from a rehabilitation counselor and receive services from specialists and agencies if needed in order for the rehabilitation process to be successful. There are 5 philosophical principles that define a counselor's role in the rehabilitation process. 1, the rehabilitation counselor must be able to identify the strengths of their client and create a rehabilitation plan focused around those strengths. 2, the rehabilitation counselor must be able to recognize their client's potential and help their client develop skills that will help them achieve their full potential. 3, the rehabilitation counselor must work with other counselors, specialists, professionals, and agencies and/or organizations to ensure their client receives adequate and appropriate services during the rehabilitation process. 4, the rehabilitation counselor must acknowledge their client is a member of a family unit or another large social group, and that the client's role in that group may impact their rehabilitation process. And 5, the rehabilitation counselor must ensure their client continues to make progress toward the goal or goals agreed upon in the rehabilitation plan. There are 4 philosophical principles of rehabilitation counseling related to treatment planning. 1, when planning treatment, it is the rehabilitation counselor's responsibility to adjust the treatment to suit the unique needs of the client. 2, when planning treatment, it is the rehabilitation counselor's responsibility to design a treatment plan that accounts for all factors that affect the functioning and overall well-being of the client, not just focus treatment on the primary factors. 3, when planning treatment, it is the rehabilitation counselor's responsibility to ensure the client continues receiving treatment until it is no longer needed. And 4, when planning a treatment, it is the rehabilitation counselor's responsibility to provide the client with all information necessary to create and implement a successful treatment plan. And there are 3 philosophical principles defining society's role in the rehabilitation process. 1, society has a responsibility to provide equal rights for individuals with disabilities. 2, society has a responsibility to develop agencies and programs that help individuals obtain basic resources and ensure individuals with disabilities have access to necessary services. And 3, society has a responsibility to provide employment opportunities and reasonable accommodations to individuals with disabilities whenever possible and take action against those who actively discriminate against individuals with disabilities. Laws and public policy affecting people with disability. Historical laws and policies from 1917 to 1973. The Smith-Hughes Act of 1917 matched 1-to-1 state funding with federal funding to provide vocational education programs. The Soldiers' Rehabilitation Act of 1920 authorized providing vocational rehabilitation services to veterans who became injured or disabled through their service in World War I. The Smith-Vest Act of 1920 expanded rehabilitation services to civilians as well as soldiers. The Social Security Act of 1939 made the state and federal VR program permanent. The Randolph-Shepard Act of 1936 authorized individuals with visual impairments to operate vending stands in federal buildings. The Wagner-O'Day Act of 1938 required the federal government to purchase designated supplies and products from workshops staffed by individuals with visual impairments. The Barden-La Follette Act of 1943 expanded vocational rehabilitation services to include individuals with mental disabilities and established a state federal assistance and service program for individuals with visual impairments. The Vocational Rehabilitation Act amendments of 1954 made changes to the current legislations, i.e. the Smith-Fess Act, and provided dedicated funding to universities with the explicit use to train master's level rehabilitation counselors. This resulted in the professionalization of the rehabilitation counseling profession. The Vocational Rehabilitation Act Amendment of 1965 added an extended evaluation to the VR process. And the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 mandated services for individuals with the most severe disabilities, mandated program evaluation to measure program success and assess needed changes to the system, prohibited employers from discriminating against hiring individuals with disabilities, established the Individualized Written Rehabilitation Plan, IWRP, to ensure client involvement in the rehabilitation process, established the Implemented Client Assistance Programs, or CAPS, to assist with employment application and advocacy services, increased funding for rehabilitation and disability research, established the National Institute of Handicapped Research, and implemented Title V, which establishes employment rights for individuals with disabilities. And there are 4 sections. Section 501, Affirmative Action in Federal Hiring. Section 502, Enforcement of Accessibility Standards for Federal Buildings. Section 503, Affirmative Action by Federal Contract Recipients. And Section 504, Equal Opportunities in Education. Contemporary Laws and Policies, 1978 to 2014. The Rehabilitation Act Amendments of 1978 mandated provision of independent living services in the rehabilitation process. The Rehabilitation Act Amendments of 1984 mandated the establishment of client assistance programs. The Rehabilitation Act Amendments of 1986 added rehabilitation engineering to available rehabilitation services and established supported employment as an acceptable goal for rehabilitation services. The Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, of 1990 implemented the most comprehensive civil rights protections for people with disabilities designed to prevent discrimination and enable maximum participation and access in society. The ADA consists of 5 titles. Title I is Employment, which guarantees equal opportunity for employment and access to reasonable accommodations in employment positions. Title II is Public Services and guarantees individuals will not be denied any public services on the basis of their disability. Title III, Public Accommodations, requires public facilities to provide equal access to all individuals, e.g. installing stair ramps, ensuring doorways of adequate width, wheelchair-accessible restrooms, etc. Additionally, all new construction must incorporate accessibility into design aspects. Title IV is Telecommunications and requires telecommunication companies to offer accessible telecommunication services and devices for the deaf. Title V is Miscellaneous, which prohibits coercive measures, threats, or retaliation against individuals who assert their rights under the ADA. In addition to the 5 titles, the ADA provides key concepts of the law that provides context for defining disability and outlining major components of the ADA. Major life activities mean an impairment must significantly limit one or more major life activity in order to be a disability covered by the ADA. Substantially limiting, an impairment is a disability if it significantly limits one or more major life activity, and there are 3 factors considered when determining if an impairment significantly impacts activity. 1, nature and severity, 2, expected duration, and 3, expected impact. Qualified individual with a disability is an individual with a disability who possesses the necessary skill, experience, education, and other job-related requirements to perform the employment requirements either with or without reasonable accommodations. Essential function, as it relates to job requirements, the job position exists to perform a function. There are a limited number of individuals able to perform the function of the job position, and the job function is highly specialized and the person hired to fill the position is able to perform it. Reasonable accommodation. Employers are required to provide reasonable accommodations to employees with disabilities. Reasonable accommodations are those that do not create undue hardship on the organization. Reasonable accommodation relates to three aspects of employment. 1, to ensure equal opportunity in the application, interview, and selection process. 2, to enable qualified individuals to perform essential job functions. And 3, to enable employees with disabilities to enjoy equal benefits and privileges of employment. And undue hardship, an action that requires significant difficulty or expense in relation to the size of the employer, the resources available, and the nature of the operation. Undue hardship includes any action that is unduly costly, extensive, substantial, disruptive, and fundamentally alters the operation or nature of the business. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, of 1990, introduced categories of eligibility in order to receive special education services. Children with disabilities ages 3 to 21 are entitled to public education to prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. Every child will receive an individualized education plan, IEP, to ensure the public education system is meeting their needs. The IEP should promote involvement of the family and offer a range of services to support the child's learning in the least restrictive environment. IEPs will be planned and monitored by individualized education programs or an individualized family service plan. The Rehabilitation Act amendments of 1992 established qualified personnel standards to ensure the quality and competency of state, federal VR agency counselors. VR counselors must hold a master's degree level education and hold counselor certification. Increased the federal funding match to 78.7%. Increased an emphasis on recruiting and training VR counselors from minority backgrounds. Established rehabilitation advocacy councils. Established 60-day maximum time period to determine if a client is eligible to receive VR services. In regards to changes of practice, emphasis is placed on establishing that VR counselors must have presumption of ability and employability of the client, focused on career-based job placement for clients, improving services to minority groups, increasing client involvement in creating their individualized written rehabilitation program, improving the order of selection for those waiting to receive VR services, incorporating the use of existing data into client plans and assessments, and recognizing and incorporating the field of rehabilitation engineering into rehabilitation services, and increasing the emphasis on recruiting and training VR counselors from minority backgrounds. Changes to the current legislation, i.e. the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, increased emphasis placed on empowerment, self-determination, and informed choice, both at individual and agency levels, required qualified personnel standards to be created and enforced in state federal agencies regarding quality standards of knowledge and practice for rehabilitation counselors. The School to Work Opportunities Act of 1994 helped restructure education systems and establish school-to-work systems by providing federal venture capital grants, provided funding dedicated to supplying technical assistance, capacity building, outreach efforts, and research and evaluation. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act amendments of 1997 increased emphasis on the role of parents in the educational decision-making process, promoted meaningful access to general curriculum learning opportunities, and the focus shifted to using individualized education plan as a primary tool for education planning. The Workforce Innovation Act of 1998 joined the state federal VR program to the state workforce investment system, created a unified statewide workforce investment center by combining multiple existing employment and training programs. Individuals can now access employment information and services in the same location, and VR became a mandated partner of the Workforce Investment Center. The Rehabilitation Act amendments of 1998 introduced automatic eligibility for individuals receiving SSI or SSDI benefits, introduced a new category of services, provision of technical assistance, consultation services to individuals seeking self-employment, increased emphasis on outreach to minority populations, required medication policies and procedures to be established in an attempt to improve due process provisions, encouraged increased attention on the school-to-work transition services for individual students with disabilities, emphasis placed on helping students gain employment post-graduation, and emphasized employment services and goals by replacing the Individualized Written Rehabilitation Plan, IWRP, with the Individualized Plan for Employment, IPE, in transition services. The Ticket to Work and Work Incentives Improvement Act of 1999 offered individuals with disabilities a ticket to obtain vocational rehabilitation and support services through an employment network of the individual's choosing, and expanded Medicare and Medicaid coverage. The ADA Amendments Act of 2008 redefined and broadened the term disability to include major bodily functions as a part of major life activities. The Act also redefines and dramatically expands the scope of coverage under the regarded as component of the definition of disability. To satisfy the regarded as standard, an individual need only show that they have been subjected to an action prohibited under the statute, like termination or failure to hire, because of an actual or perceived impairment. It is no longer necessary that the impairment be perceived by the employer to limit or substantially limit a major life activity. However, to satisfy the regarded as standard, the impairment must not be one that is transitory and minor, and it broadened coverage for those who have a disability. The Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act of 2014 established an advisory committee on increasing competitive integrated employment for individuals with disabilities, mandated VR agencies dedicate at least 15% of their federal funding to providing pre-employment transition services to students with disabilities, and identified primary performance indicators to measure employment outcomes across VR and transition programs. It replaced the Ticket to Work and Work Incentives Improvement Act of 1999 and Title IV of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. This title governs the Supported Employment Program, which provides services for those with significant disabilities to obtain and maintain employment in an integrated employment setting, earning competitive wages, redistributing funding, allotted funds a 10% minimum to support youth with severe disabilities in obtaining employment, and transferred several programs from the Department of Education to the Department of Health and Human Services. Module 1.3, Professional Roles, Functions, Credentialing, and Organizations of Practice. Topics covered in this module are central rehabilitation philosophy and concepts, professional roles, functions, and relationships with other human service providers, credentialing issues related to the rehabilitation counseling profession, and organizational structure of rehabilitation counseling practice settings. Central rehabilitation philosophy and concepts. Rehabilitation counseling philosophy can be summarized into three key concepts: consumerism, empowerment, and self-determination. As defined by West and Parent in 1992, empowerment is the transfer of power and control over decisions, choices, and values from external entities to the consumers of disability services. Informed choice is the process by which consumers make insightful decisions about personal goals and necessary services. And self-determination is directing one's own course of action, which requires active personal agency in implementing informed choices. Professional roles and functions of rehabilitation counselors. According to Muthard and Salamone in 1969, state VR counselors divide their time among three roles: 1, counseling and guidance; 2, clerical work, planning, recording, and placement; And 3, professional growth, public relations, reporting, resource development, travel, and supervisory administrative duties. In addition to the roles listed previously, VR counselors typically perform 4 major functions for clients. 1, assessment. The counselor attempts to determine the strengths, weaknesses, and needs of a particular client. 2, counseling. The counselor provides career advice or emotional support to the client. 3, service. Counselors establish a relationship between service provider and employers and the client. And 4, retention. Counselor helps the client develop job skills necessary to achieve and maintain employment. The research of Leahy from 2013 has expanded on the functions listed previously and provided a detailed list of 8 additional job functions of professional rehabilitation counselors, as well as 10 knowledge and skill domains related to successful contemporary rehabilitation practices. The major job functions: 1, job placement; 2, vocational assessment and career counseling; 3, occupational information analysis; 4, counseling; 5, psychosocial interventions; 6, case management and advocacy; 7, demand-side employment; and 8, workers' compensation and forensic services. The 10 knowledge and skill domains are: 1, assessment, appraisal, and vocational evaluation; 2, job development, job placement, and career and lifestyle development; 3, vocational consultation and services for employers; 4, case management, professional roles and practices, and use of community resources; 5, foundations of counseling, professional orientation and ethical practices, theories, social and cultural issues, human growth and development; 6, group and family counseling; 7, mental health counseling; 8, medical, functional, and psychosocial aspects of disability; 9, disability management; and 10, research, program evaluation, and evidence-based practices. Many counseling and human service providers have transitioned from paper records to computer-based record keeping. Software has been developed which helps in scheduling, bookkeeping, billing, merging mailings, and more. The computer systems used most commonly in counseling agencies is known as Computer Managed Counseling, CMC. A similar but different computer program used in counseling is known as Computer Assisted Counseling, CAC. When utilizing CAC, consumers directly interact with the computer interface. They answer questions, provide information, take surveys or questionnaires, provide feedback, and more. CMC, however, is only used by counseling professionals and those working within the agency, and is considered to be a tool used to manage the agency's work, rather than gathering information directly from consumers. Credentialing versus licensing in rehabilitation counseling. All rehabilitation counselors must pass the CRC examination in order to become a Certified Rehabilitation Counselor, CRC. Applicants must apply to take the exam and must have achieved or close to achieving a master's or doctorate in rehabilitation counseling. Clinical rehabilitation counseling, or an allied field, such as psychology, counseling, physical therapy. In many cases, applicants must have completed additional coursework, such as medical aspects of disability, psychosocial aspects of disability, and professional orientation and ethical practice, and internships, typically 600 hours, or employment experience are required for most applicants. Applicants must submit educational transcripts and employment verification forms before registering for the exam, and some categories require the applicant to submit descriptions of course syllabi or supervision verification forms. After applying and passing the CRC examination, counselors will receive a Certified Rehabilitation Counseling credential. This credential allows the counselor to practice in any state and is not dependent upon specific state requirements. If counselors wish to further their credentials, they can apply to be a licensed professional counselor, or LPC, but this exam has standards created by each state, and the licensure is not transferable between states. i.e., if you pass your LPC exam in Alabama, you are only licensed to practice in Alabama. If you move to Ohio and wish to keep your LPC credential, You must retake the LPC exam or pursue the standards related to Ohio. Organizational settings of rehabilitation counseling practice. Although rehabilitation counselors can work in a variety of settings, there are 4 areas in which VR counselors most commonly work. 1. Public, which is state, federal VR agencies. 2. Private, not-for-profit rehabilitation centers, often specialized and focus on one type of disability. Private, for-profit insurance programs, forensic rehabilitation, life care planning, and not-for-profit community rehabilitation providers and centers for independent living. In addition to these 4 most common organizations, VR counselors can also work in insurance companies, rehabilitation centers, general hospitals, business corporations, colleges and universities, and more.